There's reason to believe that we'll see the best version of Brandon Ingram next season because, spoiler alert, we've actually already seen the blueprint before. I'll tell you why Ingram might look like he did in his first season in New Orleans. It's a Thursday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Thursday, final show of the week. By the way, we are down to 3 days a week for the next month or so here on Locked On Pelicans. We're going to talk about Brandon Ingram and why I'm optimistic that you're going to see a very good version of him in a New Orleans Pelicans uniform next year. The blueprint is already there, and we're going to dive into the numbers, the lineups, and what could unlock him and get him back to being the best version of Brandon Ingram. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well, and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday, or like the 3 days a week that we are right now. So let's get into Brandon Ingram. One of the things he said was, in his end of season media availability, when asked about the 3-point shooting and the decline that's gone through basically every single season he's been in New Orleans, it's more or less gone down from, his high a couple of years ago, his first year in New Orleans when he won Most Improved Player, to last year where, it just felt like it didn't really fit and there was overall concern about things. So, part of the reason I bring this up right now too is because it's about shot quality. And the B-Ball Index on Twitter tweeted out a graphic showing that Ingram's a good shot maker, and that's a little bit of a misleading graphic, but his shot quality across the board is an F, and that's not a great situation for him to be in. He takes difficult shots, creates difficult shots for himself, and happens to make those better than other people, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's still good because the overall efficiency is low. And that's where he's struggled the past couple of years, maybe playing with Zion. But there's reasons to believe that he can be back to where he was. And look, if New Orleans keeps him, and we'll talk about Jarrett Allen signing an extension with the Cavaliers and what that means, if that takes a trade target off the board or not, kind of not. Ingram being the best version of himself is what the Pelicans absolutely need. He can do it. Let's go back to the year that he won Most Improved Player, made the All-Star game, and that was 2019-2020, his first year in New Orleans. That lineup with him, so there's kind of two parts to that story. There was the first part of the year without Zion Williamson, and then the games that he played with Zion. And he played 22 games with Zion that year. Zion only played 24 games, so the sample size is somewhat limited. But Ingram changed, and the starting lineup of Lonzo Ball, Jrue Holiday, Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and Derek Favors was really good. 90th percentile on defense, 63rd percentile on offense, and it had an 18.4 net rating. Right? Your starters need to beat up opponent starters. That's how you're going to really win lots of games. And New Orleans kind of dipped backwards last year. That starting lineup was good. 18.4 net rating. You remember Nicolo Melli? You put him in instead of Derek Favors, and it was still a positive net rating of 14.7. That's all really good. And there's reason to believe that Ingram can get back to that because, look, that starting lineup had a true point guard in it, in Lonzo Ball. Or had a point guard in it, in Lonzo Ball. And guess what? The new starting lineup for the Pelicans is going to have a point guard in it. DeJounte Murray. That's why we're bringing that up. If Ingram is willing to not be the facilitator and go more towards playing a little bit off ball, but more just being a shot maker instead of a creator and putting so much of a burden on himself, he can be really good. And that's going to be on him, right? That's the question is, can he do this? Will he do this? Because you look at some of the stats last season compared to that 2019-2020 season, and you see a stark difference in how he played. You can even watch it on the film, right? He was far more off ball, far more decisive, less dribbling. That year he won most improved player and just was like instinctual and trying to score, and that works really well for him. He's a good shooter. He's a good three-point shooter. Don't overthink it. Take the open shot. Look at touch time. That's one thing that I think is really telling here, and this is measured on NBA.com/stats. Last season, about 25% of his shot attempts came with a touch time of less than 2 seconds. 50% was kind of in that middle range of things too, from 2 to 4 seconds. And then basically you have touch time of 6 or more seconds, and that's where you've just been holding the ball for a while. His shot quality is like 25% quick, 50% in the middle, and then 25% like long. When you go back to that season when he was most improved player, 40% of his shots came from touching the ball 2 seconds or less, 2 or fewer, I forget what it is, right? Only 25% of his shots had a touch time of 6 or more seconds last year. It was 15%, 10% less in his most improved season, right? You see where I'm going with this. The longer he has the ball in his hands, he either dribbles himself into some trouble or he bails himself out with a mid-range because that's what he's comfortable with. If you take some of the dribbling, the touch time out of there and let him play off ball with someone manufacturing open shots for him, that's going to work. That's going to really, really work. So I mention all this because he was playing with a point guard then, and guess what? He's playing with a point guard this season. You look at his numbers, that latter half of 2019-2020 with Zion Williamson, 21 points, 4 assists, but right at 6 threes per game. His efficiency was significantly higher. There is no excuse not to play like that again this season, right? Say it was he needed a point guard. Okay, they've acquired one. Now, Zion does that, creates open shots for him. He didn't take more threes. That's slightly concerning, but maybe he needs it in a guard. You have a point guard this year in DeJounte Murray, and DeJounte Murray could absolutely unlock Brandon Ingram. But that's on Brandon Ingram, right? Your question might be, will he actually do that? He's been trending down in terms of 3-point attempts, and I say, maybe. He's done it before. Look, in his final year in LA, he took 1.8 3-point attempts per game. That bumped up to 6.2 his first year in New Orleans. He changed his play style. He fit in then, right? It's up to him if he wants to do it again. And if he does, because again, there's evidence that he's done it. No reason he can't do it again. There's no excuses not to be very, very good. And if he does that, yes, his scoring numbers might drop a little bit. It might not be 24 points per game. But if it's at 20, 21, and he's taking threes and his efficiency goes up, this team is going to win more games. There's questions right now about Zach LaVine sacrificing his stats for himself, to help the Chicago Bulls win and buy in and fit into what they're doing. It's not to near the same extreme with Brandon Ingram, but if he wants to win games, Zach LaVine's never really been on a winner. You're going to have to sacrifice a little bit. If Ingram's willing to do that this coming year with DeJounte Murray, with Zion Williamson, lesser extent with CJ McCollum, they can win games, but it's going to take that sacrifice from him. If he's willing to do it, this team is going to win a lot of games, even with a subpar center, and we'll get into why coming up later in the show. But now I'm bringing all of this up about Brandon Ingram, fitting in, being the best version of himself, because did just a major trade partner take themselves out of the running with the Cleveland Cavaliers signing Jarrett Allen to an extension? Let's talk about that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. There's no NBA. It's disappointing. We can't bet on NBA games like we normally do with all of the fun player props, odds, different things. But guess what? There's still sports going on. And so FanDuel is giving you a boost or a bonus, all customers, a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. And all I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime in the mood. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. You want to get in on who's going to hit a home run on any given night. You can do that with their player props. You still have the Olympics and other sports going on. So yeah, there's no NBA right now, but FanDuel can keep it going all summer long. So FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the official sports betting partner of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen today, Locked On Saints, Ross Jackson, making sense of everything black and gold. He's there at training camp on the road in Irvine, California, breaking it all down for you all live every single day, pretty much. Subscribe and make Locked On Saints your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the big news on Wednesday was that the Cleveland Cavaliers are locking up their core four. Mistake, not a mistake, we'll find out in the future. And that meant giving Jarrett Allen an extension. So he's now under contract for 5 years with a 3-year extension tacked onto his deal. He's basically averaging around $26 million per year right now, but the final 3 years of the deal, that goes up closer to right around kind of what Brandon Ingram's making in the mid-30s. Does this take them out of the running for a Brandon Ingram trade? The answer is yes and no to that question. And that's why we spent the first segment of this show focusing on the good that Brandon Ingram can do. Because right now, yes, it's looking more likely that he's going to be back than not. Because now, the trade partners have been not there. The Cavaliers have made a ton of sense. But now you cannot trade Jarrett Allen to New Orleans today. When you sign these extensions, it comes with a only 6 month, no trade clause. So the good news with this is, depending on exactly when it's signed, now we don't know if he put, pen to paper, ink to paper today or not, but you have right now until January, in theory, 31st, to be able to, that's the day that he could be traded again. That's before the presumed February 6th NBA trade deadline. So you have potential here for, it's not presumed, that's the date of the trade deadline. So he can be dealt this season. Just, you have about a week to be able to get a deal done. So it takes them out of the running for Brandon Ingram right now. But it doesn't take them out of the running for Brandon Ingram for good. And the Cavaliers have made a lot of sense as a trade partner for New Orleans for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of positional overlap. Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland in the backcourt. By the way, both of them are on extensions now. The front court is also on extensions in Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. And we've seen from this past year that we don't really know if those players can coexist. Kind of sounds similar to New Orleans here. But while New Orleans is more willing to kind of break it up, the Cavaliers are trying to run it back right now. And that's because, as I've often said, if you're an everyday or a longtime listener of this show, I do think before you break up your core group of guys, you kind of go through like a triage list, right? The first and foremost thing to do is change the head coach, right? Change the head coach. They did that this offseason, bringing in Kenny Atkinson. Maybe just a different perspective, a different coach and a different coaching staff will use your players differently. And you almost always do that before you break up these, big name backcourts, front courts, big name players. The Milwaukee Bucks did it twice, brought in 2 new head coaches before kind of breaking up the team, right? Of Damian Lillard and, at this point now, Giannis, right? So that's what they're doing first. But here's the thing. They gave themselves an out to fix this. That is a lot of money committed to 4 players where there's positional overlap, particularly to be in the East, where you need wings. And they don't really have like elite wings, and you need scoring wings because you're competing with the Boston Celtics, who have Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And there's other wings in the East that you've just got to keep in mind. So Cleveland is kind of in that position where they need to figure this out right now. And they're going to give it a go. But if it doesn't work, at the trade deadline, you can make a move still, right? I'd rather pay 2 guards, a wing, and a center versus 2 guards and 2 centers. And that's what those players are. Mobley and Jarrett Allen are centers. And that's why we saw them maybe not quite work next to each other. They also don't shoot 3-pointers, really. And we've learned that can you really have 2 starting players that don't really shoot threes. And while Mobley has shown some ability to do so, it's not like he's a volume three-point shooter or anything like that. So I've seen a lot of people saying like, hey, this takes the Pelicans out of the running for Jarrett Allen. No, it doesn't. It just takes them out of the running for Jarrett Allen right now in this moment. But I think that was kind of natural. I didn't think at this point, given that they're kind of going through my normal checklist of what do you do before you trade big name players, you're going to go and roll it out and see see if it works. So we're still kind of on the timeline to get Jarrett Allen here in New Orleans, potentially. It was always at this point going to be around the trade deadline this coming season. That to me hasn't really changed. There's still a week for both these teams to really shake up their rosters during the season. That's why at this point, unless New Orleans really wants to keep Brandon Ingram, you're not going to give him an extension. Because if you don't give him an extension in the next 5-6 days, essentially, you can't trade him at all during the regular season. So you either know he's going to be one of your future guys all of next year, and then you could trade him next offseason. That maybe is the move. But if you think this is kind of a make or break year and you need to give him that extension right now, you can't trade him. So if you feel like you've got to deal him to get other pieces, you don't do it. That's why that August 6th date is something that a lot of people have been talking about. And we've talked about here when it came to a Brandon Ingram extension, because you do it after that date, it goes past the trade deadline, and at that point doesn't end up happening. So this to me doesn't change a ton, because it does seem like New Orleans is going to really take this down to the wire with Brandon Ingram. That they will go into next season without an extension, maybe try and move him at the deadline or during the regular season. Maybe it just materializes with Cleveland if, they're, think about what David Griffin said at the end of the year. We've erred on the side of continuity, but we've seen it doesn't work. Last season for the Cavaliers was kind of like a clear indication that it probably doesn't work, but they want to try it a little bit longer. I don't know if they want to try it for a full other season when you want to win and you're paying a lot of money. And if you're not winning, that's hard to swallow, and that might lead to changes during the season, not necessarily during the off season. So that's why I do think this is kind of how it was always going to go with the Pelicans. So it takes Jarrett Allen off the table like this moment, but I don't think it takes Jarrett Allen off the table this season. And that's why the answer is like yes and no to the question that we proposed at the beginning. I also do think this makes Jarrett Allen a little less appealing. That's some big money they gave to him for a guy that's like not an elite player. And if you're trading Brandon Ingram, that's kind of what you'd ideally like to get back in return, or you could trade him for pieces and use that to minorly upgrade too and just add more depth to the team. But if you're an everydayer, you listened to me talk about the depth yesterday, and I think the depth here is actually okay. Yes, losing Najee Marshall wasn't great, but if Trey Murphy, Herb Jones can really step up, and more on them actually in the next segment here, I do think that it'll be okay. Like particularly Trey, right? Can he anchor a second unit? I think that makes up for some of the lack of Najee Marshall, assuming Trey is coming off the bench and not starting. We still don't know. But with so many players, you're going to run different rotations here than you might normally. And that, I think, makes up for the lack of depth, that you're still going to have 2 of the 4 main guys on the court at any given time, maybe even 3 out of the 4 on the court at any given time. That can make up, I think, for a little bit lack of depth, because the top-end depth here in New Orleans is really good. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you want to play it out with Brandon Ingram? Is that too much for you? Can you risk losing him for nothing? Because that's a little bit of the game that the Pelicans are playing here. It's a game of chicken. If you can't do that, do you want to give him an extension? Do you just want to let him walk at the end of the year? Let me know in the comments down below. So next segment, when I was going through a lot of the data on that 2019-2020 season, feels like forever ago, right? There's some lineup similarities here. And I think that can fix a problem that the Pelicans had this past year. Let's look at that. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Now, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Do you have to turn down the volume without all the yelling? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we're looking at kind of Brandon Ingram with this team. And I think there's a lot of reason for optimism for him to kind of just get back to being the best version of him. He said he needed a point guard to do it. You've got one in DeJounte Murray. Now, look, we learned that wasn't CJ McCollum, and that's okay. CJ's an elite shooter, was elite at it last year, still fits into this team, can be a movable piece too. If Brandon Ingram gets back to being that version of himself, everything else on this Pelicans team will fall right into place, and I'm not worried about it. Look, let's go back to that 2019-2020 season, right? They wasn't great. That was the bubble year, COVID and all of that. And in the bubble, the Pelicans really disappointed. Zion came back into the bubble after leaving the bubble with, an undisclosed injury, was out of shape and just wasn't himself. Let's say that those problems around Zion are kind of removed because he has definitely improved his conditioning, his fitness, and there's reasons to believe he's really bought into what he's doing here in New Orleans in that, after last year where he played the majority of the season, even if he wasn't in the best shape to start the year, maybe he learned from that, will be in the best shape to start the year, and there we go. And it sounds like it's going to be more of a Zion-centric offense, that it's going to be a little bit less Brandon Ingram, more Zion, more DeJounte Murray with Ingram working off ball. If he buys into that and plays at the level he did in that 2019-2020 season when he was an all-star and one most improved, that works for me. I don't care about the center position then. While I think you need some decent center play, the Pelicans had Derek Favors, Jackson Hayes, and Nicolo Melli basically as their starting centers. It wasn't good, right? That wasn't particularly great. Derek Favors wasn't good that year. Nicolo Melli, it just never worked, right? So with that in mind, why can't this Pelicans team kind of do the same thing? Now, you're going to point to that Pelicans record that year and say, well, they weren't good. And you are, in fact, correct. But that was also because they didn't have Zion Williamson for the majority of games. And once he started playing, they started winning at an above 500 rate, even if it wasn't high, right? But they showed something there. And if you're an everydayer of the show, if you're just a longtime listener for this past season, we talked about net rating with the starters not being great and that the Pelicans were beating up on bench units. It was the opposite, really, for that team. The starting unit for New Orleans was good. Lonzo Ball, Drew Holiday, Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and Derek Favors was killer. We mentioned the net rating in the beginning of the show, 18.4, positive 18.4. They had a negative net rating of 0.9, so negative 1. Think about the difference there, basically 20. They had some better depth, better lineups, better play from some of their guys. That team, in theory, had potential to be very good. Now, they didn't have Zion Williamson for the majority of it, and that's part of the reason. Because Zion Williamson, basically any lineup you put out there, it was good. Say you're getting a good version of Zion Williamson here. Think about the similarities to this lineup. Say CJ McCollum's on the bench, and your starting lineup. Okay, so Lonzo Ball's replacement is DeJounte Murray. Slightly different players, more advanced game offensively, I think, for Murray, even though Lonzo was a good shooter then. At the two-guard position, you had Drew Holiday. Let's put Herb Jones there. So DeJounte Murray and Herb Jones. Then you have Brandon Ingram. Then you have Zion Williamson. Then it was Derek Favors. Again, Favors wasn't particularly good that season. 9 points, 10 rebounds per game. That was about it. Not giving you rim protection or anything like that. Can you get 10 and 10 from Daniel Tice, from Carlo Makovich, from Yves Missi? Quite possibly. That's not asking a whole lot, right? And you probably have better defensive upside with that there. So you see that lineup that was positive 18.4, and there's direct parallels, similarities to what's currently on the Pelicans. That gives me a lot of optimism for them being able to make this work. That's not even factoring Trey Murphy and CJ McCollum into this either, right? The energy that Jose Alvarado brings off the bench. Now, that team that we're talking about with New Orleans finished 30-42, so 12 games under 500. But again, when Zion Williamson played, they were 9 and they were like 1 or 2 games above 500, I believe. I think they were something like 11-9 or whatever it was during the regular season, not counting the bubble when he was injured and not his best version of himself. I think they were 9-8, something like that. They were like 1 or 2 games above 500. That bodes well over the course of a season with a better version of Zion Williamson. Maybe a better player in DeJounte Murray, an elite defender still in Herb Jones. Center play doesn't matter. And if you get that version of Brandon Ingram, the bought-in version of Brandon Ingram, the kind of team-first version of Brandon Ingram, this team can be good. I don't doubt that, right? Like, they looked significantly better once Zion was playing. Do that again. And I think you can win games, assuming there's health. And you even have a little bit of insurance should health not be a factor. That's why I'm pretty optimistic about this team. Now, admittedly, for the longtime listeners, I err on the side of optimism. There's no point in coming on the show and being like, they suck, don't watch, right? Kind of means there's no point in doing a show. So I always look for ways they can be good and interesting. And I'm seeing that here with some of that, right? Upgraded point guard play, unlocking Brandon Ingram a little bit. Better version of Zion Williamson. Yeah, you need some center play, but I don't think you need that much. And I do think the depth is okay here in New Orleans. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans this week. We were Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this week. We'll probably be Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week, and we'll keep that kind of rhythm, though I've got some travel mixed in that might adjust it. But we'll be 3 days a week for the next month or so, and then really ramp back up for start of training camp media day, get you set for the regular season here. So please subscribe to the Locked On Pelicans podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube as well. We are the #1 Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all early next week.